In today's video, we're going to talk about distance, specifically how your distance to your subject affects the look of your portraits. And if you've never given it much thought, trust me, you'll be surprised how much of a difference it makes. Hey everybody, Lindsay Adler here. When you're taking a portrait, there are so many things we already have to consider to make a successful image. We think about things like lighting, posing, aperture, shutter speed, other technical elements, but there's one variable that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, and that is our distance to our subject. So the question is, does it really matter? Does your distance to your subject actually change how the photo looks? And the answer is yes, it definitely does. I will say, this is not necessarily the main variable, but it's an important one because it gives you even more control over the look and feel of your image. So today, what I want to do is I want to break down how your distance to your subject affects the image on its own, but also how it works together with the variable of focal length to shape both technical and creative outcomes of your shots. Now, it is usually these two, your distance to your subject and your focal length, that work together to change how your images look. Now, when I explain these elements, I want to keep it practical and straightforward. I don't want to get into scientific breakdowns because when I first learned about these concepts, somebody showed me by doing like math and diagrams, and I just kind of glazed over. Now, if you want this information, it's definitely out there. You can look it up easily. But instead, what I want to do is I want to talk about real world examples, how you can actually apply this to your photography and why it matters. Let's start talking about depth of field. Now, as you know, depth of field is affected by several things. Of course, your aperture, but it is also affected by the distance of your camera to the subject and your focal length. It is how all three of these variables work together. And I've always found it useful to look at something called the depth of field calculator. This is a tool, you can get it online for free, or you can get an app that takes into consideration your sensor size, your focal length, your aperture, and your distance to the subject. And then it shows you how much depth of field you will actually have. And what's cool is you can learn a lot before you even pick up your camera. So let's take a look at it. For example, let's plug in some numbers. For the camera, we're gonna go with a Canon 5D Mark III. My focal length is 85 and my aperture is f4. So the only variable left is distance. So let's see what happens if we're standing 10 feet away. And then I move 4 feet away from my subject. At 10 feet away, I have about a foot of depth of field. But when I move closer to 4 feet, now I have 1.8 inches. I've changed nothing else except for my distance to the subject. The depth of field shrinks significantly. And of course, that makes a big visual change. So, all right, now let's actually switch it up. We're gonna keep the distance to the subject the same, so 10 feet, but I'm going to change the focal length only. So plugging in 50 millimeters for our focal length, I have about 3 feet of depth of field when I'm at f4. But if I keep everything the same, and I just change my focal length to 100 millimeters, it changes to 8.5 inches of depth. So again, distance to your subject as well as your focal length work together. So when I combine all of these things together, it makes a huge difference. So for example, I'm going to move closer and use a longer focal length. So let's go to the 4-foot distance at f4 and shoot the 100 millimeter lens. My depth of field is 1.3 inches. And this is exactly why if you grab a macro lens, let's say the Canon 100 millimeter macro, and you get in really close, you have razor thin focus. It's because your distance to the subject is close and your focal length is close, and both of these things give you a narrower depth of field. So let's talk about why this really would matter to you. So first and foremost, you now realize that if you want to blur out your background more, you can do it with aperture, yes, but you could also get closer to your subject, or you can use a longer focal length, or all of these things together. And if you want to check it ahead of time, you can use your depth of field calculator and you can see how they all work together. Now on the flip side, actually where I use this more often is when I'm photographing a group of people. If you're too close, or I use too long of a focal length, either one of these can create a narrow depth of field, which means if I have a group of people in layers, the person in the front and the person in the back might not both be in focus. So that's really important for practical reasons. And then specifically for me as a beauty photographer, I've been asked to shoot close-ups of macro mascara and eyelashes. And if I'm using a macro lens where I'm really close, even at f16, I cannot get all of the eyelashes in focus. So I'm actually better off backing up and then cropping into the image if I need to have a lot of depth of field. So basically what this comes down to is knowing the effect of your distance to your subject, your aperture, and your focal length, how they all work together. It gives you more tools to control your depth of field beyond just the single variable of aperture. All right, so now what we're going to do is shift to another important effect. the effect of perspective and the distortion that comes with it. So again, we're talking about the distance to your subject. When you are physically closer to your subject, especially if you're using a wider angle lens, features can look exaggerated or warped. So for example, a 15mm lens, not that wide. If you're a few feet away, everything looks good. But once you get closer up, the nose looks a little larger, the ears recede, the face looks wider. And it's not just about facial distortion, it also affects the way your subject relates to the background. When you are really close up to your subject, it can be hard to fit your subject on a background, especially in the studio. Basically, they become disconnected from it. They look larger, the background looks smaller. So the opposite is also true. If you back up, then zoom in, the subject now fits on the background. The distortion flattens, the features look more proportional, the subject fits better on the background, and this is because you're narrowing your field of view when you use a longer lens. And so backing up, using that longer lens fits the subject. Now, if you can't remember this concept in the studio, an easy way to think of it is if you're photographing someone outside and there's a building in the background. If I get really close with a wide angle lens, the person looks huge, but the building looks really tiny. And so if I want to even out proportions, I back up and zoom in, the subject looks more even, and then the background will actually appear larger. This is why you have to add your camera's distance to this subject as well as your focal length into the equation for adjusting how the background appears. So while your distance to your subject and your focal length doesn't sound like the most exciting tools in your toolkit, when you understand how they work together, you actually unlock a lot of control. Because now you can narrow your depth of field and you can change your perspective, you can adjust distortion, you can better compose your subject against the background, all of these things when you look at those two variables. And that's the thing with photography, there's not one single thing that guarantees a successful portrait. It's all of these small, thoughtful choices that work together. And the more that you understand all of these choices working together, the more control and of course, creative freedom you have in the moment. All right guys, so if you want to see my core kit, the tools that I use, like the Canon R5 Mark II and the Canon RF 24 to 105mm lens, those are my favorite. You can check the links in the description below. And if you are picking up your gear, be sure to visit Adorama.com. Now, hopefully you've enjoyed this video. And if you like to learn more about the basics of photography, as well as creative lighting, working with models, everything from simple to more advanced, I've probably got a video on it. So be sure to like and subscribe. See you next time, guys.